Howdy, folks. What's going on? This is the Outlaw Hatfield back at you one more time. Tonight, we are back to our regular scheduled interviews. It's been a while since I've actually done one. Um, in fact, I think it's probably been a couple of months. It's just getting these things scheduled with people is a pain in the rear because, you know, my schedule and their schedules just most of the time do not mesh. But tonight, we definitely have a guest on. That guest, that guest is the gentleman formerly known as Dog Body Official. Um, and now he is going by what is it, Muscle Dog Mafia?
Yeah, so I basically rebranded everything over to Muscle Dog Mafia, so that way people shares the name with the website for muscledogmafia.com. But as everybody on gun channels just knows me, I'm just Dog.
Yep, you. That's how I've always known you. Anyway, it's just Dog. Ladies and gentlemen, he's got a new book out, and let me show you the book here. This is the cover of the book. And it's about how to train a dog for basics for beginners is how I think he would want this to be promoted. The training and diet theory of max potential. We're going to be discussing the book a little bit tonight and maybe plug him a little bit, get him some sales out there. So, what was the idea behind the book to begin with, man?
I grew up and have spent the vast majority of my life embedded in dog culture at some level or another. And one of the things that has driven me crazy since I was a teenager has been people who have dogs that either they abuse by neglect or by people who think they're doing right because, they knew someone who gave them some advice or they watched a TV show. People who mean to do well but do a lot of wrong just because nobody ever told them otherwise. And there's so much misinformation out in the dog world. And some of that information comes from what, you would hope would be reliable sources. And I got tired of it. And I've always wanted to be like, there's nothing out there that is open to people really that was affordable that could get somebody who either has a dog or is thinking about getting a dog to really just get them not set on I almost like to call it like a zealot path. A lot of books that were out there, people read them, and if it's their first book into dogs, then they think that's all the knowledge they ever need. I wanted to write something that would get people started, but hopefully by the time they were done with it, it would open them up to wanting to learn more. I guess would be the way.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good thing. I mean, when I was a kid, we had dogs. We always had dogs. Very little training went into them. They knew to go out. They knew to come in. And other than that, as a kid, we just let them be. The grandpa had hunting dogs, of course, and they were well trained dogs that he trained himself. But as far as the pets, and there was at that point in time, wasn't like today. There was a difference between the dogs you kept as pets and then your hunting dogs. These were these were two completely separate entities, and you treated them completely different from one another. They babied hunting dogs. Hunting dogs were babies.
Yep.
The pets were, just pets. They were there. They got fed table scraps or what have you. I mean, nowadays that's sort of frowned upon.
Well, what we had a cultural shift that happened around the mid 80s into the 90s where all of a sudden everybody started babying their dogs, regardless of whether the dog was a working dog or not. All dogs started to get babied real hard. And that wasn't a bad thing. I mean, to a certain extent, that was a good thing. Dog nutrition, in some aspects, got better. People realizing that dogs need, it wasn't a good idea to just leave the dog in the yard and not pay any attention to it. But what happened that was sort of a negative about that whole thing is now we have these people spending a lot of money on the dogs, but we had less dogs that were actually working. So you find things like a lot more obese dogs nowadays. Like, who ever heard of a fat dog when we were growing up? That wasn't a common thing. Nowadays, one of the leading causes of hip problems in dogs isn't genetic. It's actually because the dogs are obese. And so they're burning out their joints. In the last 10 years, we've watched the rate of diabetes in dogs. Again, another thing that when we were growing up, you never heard of a diabetic dog. And nowadays, a diabetic dog ratio has gone up more than 200%. It's now not uncommon for 1 in 20 dogs to be on insulin.
Wow, that's incredible. Before we get going any further with this, I have to make a public apology here. Earlier this week, I had mentioned on another show that it was supposed to be me and Ghost doing the chat tonight. I had my schedule all screwed up. Next week will be me and Ghost if Ghost is available. That was my fault. I miscommunicated. For anybody that was expecting Ghost Tactical, I apologize wholeheartedly for that. That was my goof. Once I had looked at the calendar and realized what I'd done tonight, I always do that before the shows. I double check, and I had realized the mistake I made, and I was already on Matt's chat, so you know. Ghost, I've seen you out there. I apologize to you, brother. I am sorry. Um, it was my mistake, and I apologize. And that sort of thing happens. I got busy and just wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. So that's no excuse, but that's the only excuse I've got. And I do apologize. With that being said, let's get this back on track. I haven't really had time to do an in-depth read of the book. I have hit some of the headers, and it's from what I have read, it's very well written. You went into quite a bit of detail in certain aspects, especially when it got into the training. But what I want to hit on now is this dog food. You were talking about the dogs being on insulin.
Yeah.
What would cause a dog to become diabetic?
Well, one, obesity is your number one cause. That doesn't, any mammal that becomes obese increases its likelihood of becoming diabetic. Furthermore, something that a lot of people don't realize is dog food has only been around 158 years. Dog food is not something that's very old. And prior to dog food, dogs ate scraps, like you were talking about, table scraps. They ate a lot of horse meat prior to the Industrial Revolution because there was always a horse that was nearby that would die, and a lot of people wouldn't eat it, so they fed it to the local dogs. And people fed most of the dogs, the scraps, the kills, anything from the slaughterhouse that people didn't want to consume. So dogs were on a primarily high meat diet, lots of protein, lots of fat, and carbohydrates and things that were in the dog's diet, but they were not in any kind of large volume. I often tell people that a dog is best defined not as an omnivore, but a carnivore that has some omnivoric capability. Because when you look at a dog today, and I think that most people would agree that if you look at a gray wolf is a carnivore, right?
Absolutely.
And now if I take that dog and we dissect it, and we dissect a gray wolf, and I put the two next to each other, assuming, of course, that the dogs were similar in size, and I just show you the stomach and the GI tract, you will not know the difference. They are identical. So,
Go ahead.
yes, sir. Go ahead.
No, well, I was going to ask, what types of food would you recommend for? I mean, I'm sure it would be different for different types of dogs, honestly. But what types of dogs would you recommend, or foods would you recommend for certain types of dogs?
Well, I think that your dog's diet is always going to come down to what's expected of the dog, as well as a little bit of the dog's own unique genetics. Just like with people, dogs do have a little bit of variance to them. Some dogs handle carbohydrates better than other dogs. Some dogs handle certain proteins better than others. For example, I will not feed my dogs lamb because while lamb is a perfectly good food, nobody will want to live in the house with them.
That bad, huh?
Oh, it's pretty bad. And so, I've learned that at least with the dogs that I've had, lamb wasn't a great thing. And that's not really a health factor, but it was a factor. Most of my dogs have not done good with any kind of grain. The dog I have right now, he can stomach a little bit of rice from time to time. But if I give him any kind of oat or especially if he gets hit into any kind of corn, he'll break out in hives almost immediately. So, there are things like that. And then one thing I've always learned about with the dog foods is that, pay attention to the dog. Uh, I try to tell people first, don't look if the dog is simply surviving. Look and see if the dog is thriving. And a lot of dogs on modern kibble diets hold a lot more water. The dog might not even necessarily be fat, but the dog might be holding a lot of excess water. And so I try to find foods that have the most actual animal protein in them. And, this is something that people have to turn those bags around and look at them. I encourage anybody who wants to put in the time to either feed their dog raw or feed their dog a homemade dog food, because it really doesn't take that much time and it's not very cost prohibitive to feed dogs that way. But if you're going to buy commercial food, turn the bag around. And something that dog food companies don't tell you is that the list of ingredients is determined by weight. And whatever the ingredient says, start from the first ingredient to the last ingredient, that's the volume, So if the first ingredient is, say, chicken, when that chicken was weighed before it went into the mix, that was the largest component of the mix. And so I tell people, read the first 10 ingredients. If the first 10 ingredients aren't things that your dog would eat in the wild, find a different food.
Let's backtrack a little bit here. We're going back to the front of the book. You've got a list of rules here, and I love them. And I love the first one that you've got written out. Anything the dog does wrong is your own fault. I love that quote. To me, it goes back to there's no such thing as bad dogs, just bad dog owners. Um, Another one of the rules is you must learn how to speak your dog's language. I, I think people have a lot of trouble with. Would you like to go into that a little more?
So, I mean, these were all the rules that were essentially drilled into me as a kid from my grandfather. And I've always found them to be true. Definitely anything your dog does wrong is your fault, because if you analyze the situation, I guarantee you it's your fault. But in terms of rule number 2 about speaking the dog's language, sometimes people forget because they see dogs that are trained, people who've put in the time, and they see dogs that are very well behaved. And there seems to be this misnotion that dogs completely understand when we speak to them. And a lot of people then think that there seems to be this whole forgotten element with dogs that people will think they only communicate verbally. And dogs not only react to our physical motions, and a lot of times they'll react to our physical motions much faster than verbal command, but they also display how they're feeling and their own intent with their body long before they ever act on it. And that's something that you learn by spending time and working with the dog and having somebody there to remind you, or making a note for yourself to actually watch how the dog moves, how they speak. There's this trend that started some years ago with dog trainers, where it became real popular, where they talk about positive only training. And there have been a few successes with the technique. And then there have been a lot of horror stories about trainers or owners having dogs that were absolutely out of control. And people ask, well, how come it didn't work? And what I try to remind people is, if you look at a group of dogs and how a group of dogs will communicate with each other, they will check each other, and they don't necessarily bark and things like that. An alpha dog in a group will turn and nip another dog that's getting out of line, or they'll go and they'll brush against them with their body, you know. And these physical motions, these touching between the dogs, can be used to check another dog who's acting out of line, just as much as they can be used to show emotion and affection. And so I think that a lot of people need to learn how their dogs are moving, to learn about when is your dog being, your dog's body will tell you what they're going to do. They're going to tell you if the dog is aggressive, if they're excited, if they're hurt, if they're sad, much more so than any kind of verbal communication from your dog. A lot of times, people don't know how to read dogs when they bark, but if you look at how the dog is standing when they're barking, that's what really tells you the difference between, is this dog just excitable, or is this dog, going to bite me? And then you throw into the fact that when you start communicating back with your dog, when I train a lot of my dogs, I can cause a much bigger effect in how my dog behaves by either reaching down and touching him, or by pushing my leg against his side. And again, these aren't aggressive. I'm not going out there and kicking my dog across the room. But by making that physical contact, I'm communicating and getting his attention the same way that a lead dog in the group would. And that opens up that line of communication between you and the dog. So you have to learn that there's, to use touch both negatively and positively. And once you learn how to do that, it's not as, people think that when you talk about this kind of thing, they always take it to like these horrible owners who just beat the snot out of their dogs. And I tell them, I go, it's not quite like that. But don't be afraid to, when your dog is getting out of line, when you're walking, don't be afraid to give that leash a little pop, just to remind them, hey, we're going this way. Now, don't drag your dog, don't hang your dog by the leash, but communicate with them physically, because that is so much more effective than just people who yell at their dogs and then wonder why the dog never learns anything.
Rule 3, all dogs need a purpose. I'm thinking that that's probably one that a lot of people miss.
Yeah, people. So, it's funny. You mentioned earlier, you had the hunting dogs and you had the dogs that were a pet, right? Well, somehow, as a culture, I guess we've gotten more decadent with the dogs. The concept that every dog has a natural instinct to do something, so every dog is born with a level of drive, and you need to figure out what your dog's drive is. Some dogs are really easy. Some dogs you can, you take them for their walk around the block, and that's enough for them. They're content with that. But then you have dogs who, if that's all you do, you come home and you find out they've torn your house apart. And people think, oh, well, I have a bad dog. And it's, no, you don't have a bad dog. You have a dog that you're not giving them a purpose. I've worked with a lot of pit bulls over the years, who people have told me the horror stories. This dog destroyed my couch. It destroyed my living room. It tore up my carpet. And, I ask them, well, what do you do with the dog? And they tell me, oh, well, I take the dog for 3 walks a day and they're still destroying my house. And I go, okay, have you ever taught the dog to guard the door? And they look at me dead confused. And I go, check this out. And we go to the park and I go, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have the dog sit down 10 times. We're going to walk down the field and the dog is going to sit 10 times. Just as you're walking, randomly stop, tell the dog to sit. Now you're going to tell the dog to, lay down. Okay, now tell the dog to get up. And it completely changes the dynamic. And now all of a sudden we go from working the dog physically to working the dog mentally. And they tell me, oh, wow, my dog's a lot more mellow now. I go, well, because the dog's been burnt out. You put the dog to work. Just like with us as people, sometimes our jobs aren't always physical. Sometimes our jobs are mental. And with the dogs, it's the same thing. And a high drive dog, they're not high drive because they're physically different. They're high drive because they're mentally different. And so you want to fixate and solve those drive issues. Other dogs, it can be real easy. You teach them to guard a certain object or a door. My own dogs, when I leave the house, if I don't take them with me, which is pretty rare, but if I can't take him with me, I simply tell him to guard the door, and he lays down in front of the front door, and he won't move until I come home. I might come home 12 hours later. He's still right there in front of the door. And then, we get ready to go to bed, and he acts like he's been out running in the field all day because that focused drive, that task he was given, was enough to burn him out. And that's just a matter of taking the time to learn your dog.
I think that's good advice. And Rule 4 is one that I've heard used, but mainly around sled dogs. You come second to your dog. When you got a sled dog, you depend on these dogs to get you where you're going. That's your mode of transportation. I've heard these guys say that you protect the dogs above all else. The dogs eat before you do. What's your take on that?
So, especially in modern time, in the era that we live in, your dog is 100% at your mercy. A dog gets no say in anything. They don't get to choose where they live. They don't get to choose what they eat. They don't get to choose what activities they get to go do. You decide all of those things for your dog. And in return, your dog trusts you completely. That's why there are dogs that will follow us into whatever dumb things we choose to do. That's why your house can be on fire, and if you run back inside, your dog will follow you. And because our dogs are completely at our mercy, we need to remember to take care of them. And a lot of people will take it for granted, especially people who have a tougher dog. Anything from the bully family, a lot of times falls into this trap, or large dogs in general. And that's because large dogs tend to not tell you when something's wrong with them. And so people will take their dog on a walk, and people who live in really hot climates, Los Angeles or Las Vegas or Arizona or any really hot place that's dry, and they don't think about how hot the pavement gets. Well, they also don't think about checking the dog's paws when they come home, just taking the 5 seconds to look down. And you'd be amazed at how often you find bloody paw prints because the pads have blistered up from the heat and cracked open. And now you have a dog that, because they didn't take the 10 seconds to think about how their actions would affect the dog, what would happen. There are people who will take their dogs out in the winter, and when they get home, what's the first thing a person does when they're cold from being out in the snow? They immediately want to get warmed up. They don't like being cold. They want to get warm. They want to be comfortable, but they don't think about doing anything about their dog. And it's not uncommon for dogs, because people also don't think about, they just think, oh, it's a dog, it'll be fine. Well, most breeds of dogs were not designed for the snow. They're not like the Huskies and the Malamutes. A lot of dogs will catch frostbite very quickly, especially around the legs and the underbelly. So if you bring them home and they're ice cold and you don't put in the time to get them warmed up, that dog is suffering in that time period. In my house, I don't eat if my dog doesn't eat. It's those little things. To me, a dog, you have to treat a dog just like if that dog was your kid. you know, because just like a child, they are 100% at your mercy. So you just got to, I feel you got to take that responsibility.
And again, I would say that's good advice. And rule 5, know your dog's history. I would say in this modern day and age, when people are going to get dogs and adopting them from, pet stores or what have you, you don't really know your dog's history. And uh, how do you find this out?
Well, there's two ways to look at history. There's if you're getting a dog from a breeder, of course you're going to have a full history. You're going to know the breed, you're going to know the health history, and that's all great and dandy, and that can make things a lot easier. But in the respect of adopting a dog from a shelter or something like that, there's a couple ways you can look at it. One, if you know dogs, you can look at physical traits to help narrow down what the dog might be. You can always ask other people who know dogs. We live in the era of the internet. You can go online, and I see people do it on Reddit all the time. They post a picture. Tell me what you think this dog is, and people will do their best. But we also live in an age where for $80 you can get your dog genetically tested, and they can tell you exactly what the dog is. Now,
Okay, let's go into training. How would you say that a new dog owner starts off training their dog? What's the first steps?
well, it'll depend a little bit on how old the dog is. Like if the dog's a puppy, 8 weeks old, and you come home with it, just bond with the dog. Start trying to. There's really no reason for discipline at 8 weeks old. Just play with the dog. Try to pay attention if you see the dog making the physical motions that they're going to go to the bathroom. You pick them up and put them where you want them to go. But there's not a whole lot to do with a puppy other than just make sure it lives. Play with it, have fun with it, make sure it lives, and try to instill habits like you potty on the grass. You go here to do this. But there's really not any reason for real discipline. One thing I do with my dogs that some people may or may not be okay with is I don't respond to a puppy that barks. So by the time my dogs are all 12 weeks, 16 weeks old, they've realized that barking does not get my attention. And that's just because for the type of work I raised dogs for, barking was a bad habit. So I had to work that out of them. Now, if you're working with an older dog that you've adopted 6 months, 8 months, a year, however many years old, before you bring that dog home, so long as that dog has a clean bill of health from whoever you got it from, try to get the dog in the morning on a day that you don't have to go to work and spend the day playing with that dog. Just spend a good 5-6 hours walking around, playing, and bonding with that dog before you get home. Because once you get home, rules and discipline have to come into place right away. You don't want to be mean about things, but you have to be very regimented about what's expected out of the dog for the first couple weeks at least. And that's not because people, again, people tend to take that the wrong way. Sometimes they think that people are being overly hard on a dog, and people who are soft on a dog when they bring it home, a lot of times are setting up that dog for failure. You want to come home and you want to be regimented about this is where you go, this is what you do, because you want that dog to fit into your life, and you want that dog and your relationship to be successful. So I always encourage people, especially if they're not experienced with dogs, as soon as you pick up your dog from the shelter or whoever you're adopting the dog from, spend time playing with it. And if you think this is something you really planned out, try to have an appointment with an actual dog trainer before you even bring the dog home, So that way you can pick up the dog, spend a couple hours bonding together, and then before you come home, you stop off and you meet your dog trainer, and you guys can even have, at that point, your first day of actual training. And that'll go ahead.
Do you think that there is a point where a dog is just too old to be trained out of certain habits?
Yes and no. I think basic habits can be trained at just about any age, but it depends on what instills the habit. An old dog who is, for example, there are dogs that have lived in really harsh conditions where the food is always full of bugs. And so they'll flip over their food bowl and pour the food on the ground, and they'll sort through the food before they eat it. A dog that has lived through those kind of conditions, you're never going to break that habit. That dog will never trust a food bowl. It will always dump it out. So that's a case where, yes, the dog is too old to learn that. That you can't unteach it. But when it comes to the basics, like if you have a dog that's never seen the inside of a house and the dog needs to learn to not pee in the house, that can be taught at any age, so long as there's not a health issue. Any dog can be taught how to sit, how to stay. The myth of, the dog is too old to be trained, so that therefore the dog will always be unruly, that in itself is a myth, yes.
Okay, well, so reading through the book a little bit that I did, I came across a section you've got titled "Bite Me," and you actually train your dogs to bite.
Yeah, my dogs are used for personal protection and guard work. Yeah, this is why I have signs on my property that say, "Forget the owner, beware of dog." If you're going to raise a dog and you don't want that dog to let burglars just burglarize your house, I'm sure everyone has seen the YouTube videos from the security cams. People have these big old dogs they think are going to stop burglars, and the burglar comes in the house and bribes off the dog with a treat. If you want a dog that's actually going to be a legit guard dog, you're running a risk. You're taking the same risk of carrying a gun that doesn't have a safety with a bullet in the chamber at all times. The only difference is you're not 100% in control of this thing. The gun is attached to your hip. You always have the option for it. With the dog, on the other hand, you're trying to read another creature's mind. So if you're going to have a dog that you keep some of the aggressive nature in, that doesn't mean that the dog's going to be a bad dog. It doesn't mean the dog is going to be a danger, but it means that you need to have an understanding, a 100% complete understanding of all of that dog's body language and motions that lead up to the event. If you send your dog away and have somebody else train the dog and never actually see the dog work, then you're not going to know what to look for. You're not going to know how to read your dog's body language, and things are going to get bad because your dog is going to look to you for confirmation. And if you're not paying attention, the dog will take matters into their own hands. I can read my dog's body language, and I know when they're becoming uncomfortable. I know when somebody walking up the street, and I trust my dog's judgment. If my dogs don't like somebody walking towards us, I'll turn and walk down a different path if possible, or I'll stop and have my dog heel and let that person pass us, because I trust that the dog knows there's something off with somebody. But it's because I know those things that I don't worry about my dog actually biting somebody, because I've seen everything that leads up, and I've trained my dog to not bite out of instinct, but I've taken that instinct that I've turned it into a command. Now, whenever the dog feels the urge, they start to get that antsiness about, oh, this is something, I might need to bite it. Instead of just fixating on that thing, my dog will actually start to make a physical check back to me. And they start to look to me as the leader of, do we go, do we not go? And so by teaching them to bite on command, I'm essentially building in a safety. I'm building in that mechanical safety for, instead of it going dog's afraid, dog reacts, dog bites. Now it's dog's afraid, dog looks to me for how it should react.
I like that. I like that concept. Um, I honestly think that any dog that you have should be trained to protect to an extent. Little dogs, call them ankle biters, but even an ankle biter will get your attention if you know you're an unwanted guest.
That they will.
So, I think that's good advice. Learn how to get your dog into that. Okay, do I attack? Do I hang back? What am I supposed to do next? Um, how long does it normally take you to get the dog to that point where it's okay? What do I do?
Again, I mean, there's a lot of variables that can go into that because it depends on, have you had the dog since they were a puppy, things like that. If you're starting off with a young dog who hasn't had other life experience to shape them, I can get my dogs pretty well to that point by 6, 8 months, where I'm feeling really confident about, maybe not confident because I don't think they're old enough to really get into it with somebody, but confident that I've built in that trigger mechanism. Because you start playing with them. I mean, bite training starts with a tug rope. It starts with a puppy pulling on the end of the rope when you tell them to. So it's really just taking that play that many people do with their dogs to the next level.
And again, how old do you think that the dog needs to be before you start training them like that?
I start the moment teeth come in.
So early on.
Because it's just a game. It's just from the moment those teeth start coming in and they want to chew on things anyway, of getting a rope that's the appropriate size for their mouth and dangling it and triggering them to a particular word that I know and the people in my house know that we will not say otherwise. To, okay, now you can bite this rope because we said the word. And you start working them at that point, just like that. And it's not a very aggressive game because they're a little puppy. But we start from out the gate. And as they get older and they get bigger, we slowly move things up. And depending on how the dog is physically maturing, they'll eventually move on to a bite sleeve, and eventually I'll be in a whole bite suit.
I bet that's fun having a 105-pound dog charging at you.
Oh, especially when he hits you going about 35 miles an hour. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We had some pit bulls, in my middle years, and we did a pretty good job. And we had this one solid black Amstaff, and I would spend hours out there training. And this particular dog, his name was Tiny. He was anything but tiny, but I would spend hours out there just doing, training him. And he had a vertical leap that you would not believe. He could jump taller, higher than I am tall. So it was incredible the way that this dog could jump. And there was a trust factor there that I would put a stick no more than an inch long in between my teeth, and he would jump out and take that stick out of my teeth. And people look at me like I have lost my mind letting this pit bull do something like that. Well, aren't you afraid of those teeth? Nope, not at all. The dog ain't gonna touch me. And he never did. Never even come close to drawing blood. He hit me with his nose a couple times, of course, but that's to be expected. But
getting snout punched is always fun.
oh yeah. But as far as ever worrying about him accidentally biting me, that never even occurred to me. And he was a good dog. He would, instantly, you say sit, he was instantly on the ground. That's it. And it wouldn't matter what he was doing. He could be chasing something. You say sit, he's down. And most of the time, you didn't have to say a word. It was just a hand gesture.
Mhm.
But he did have a problem with other dogs coming onto the property. He
As he
knew,
should.
yeah, he knew the ones. He knew the ones that the neighborhood dogs would come, and he wouldn't bother with them because he knew them.
Yep.
But the other, if a stray was to show up, it'd be on. And more than once, I had people come to the house. So, well, your dog attacked my dog. Well, your dog was on my property.
That's right.
You know, my dog's where he belongs. Your dog was the one that wasn't. So,
Oh, I've been through that a few times, and I always have to remind people that if it happened inside my property line, whose fault is it?
yeah, exactly. And he knew people think, especially pits, are so aggressive. I've seen Tiny let cats climb all over him. He wouldn't even bother with them. He'd lick them.
Well, I mean,
My
you're
nephews
getting
and nieces climbed all over him, pulled his ears, pulled his tail. He'd lay there and take it.
yeah. I mean, I tell people all the time, there's no such thing as a naturally evil dog. Dog. I mean, we go all the way back to rule one, right? Anything our dog does wrong is our fault. And what you're talking about with the pit bulls is sadly, the pit bull is a very easy dog to breed. It's a very durable dog, so they can survive a lot of harsh conditions. And that meant that they fell into a category where a lot of people who didn't have the means to take care of them, and most importantly, they didn't have the desire to take care of them because they saw the other aspects of the breed, such as the fact that pit bulls are great fighters.
Yes,
Pit
they
bulls.
are.
So we'll run through this really quickly. Pit bulls are a descendant of the American bulldog. Okay. Basically, they took the American bulldog and they said, we want something faster and more manageable for doing field work, hunting hogs, hunting bear, and things like that. And so they started working on a breeding project that actually started in Scotland then they brought the breeding dogs over to America, and we ended up with the pit bull. And the American pit bull terrier, of course, as soon as they found out it was a good hunting dog, because many good hunting dogs at the time were used in dog fighting, which at that time was legal and commonplace, they very quickly became the pit bull that we know, or that the legend knows, where they were the dogs famous for dog fights. They weren't even, I mean, they weren't even originally called a pit bull. They were originally an American terrier, and the pit got added later because they became synonymous with dogfighting rings. But they were originally bred as a game dog, and to be not the best game dog, but a fearless dog that would defend you against game and be willing to fight dangerous game without a hesitation. Then you throw into the fact that they had the bulldog genetics for the tolerance for pain, and the fact that pit bulls, and this is what a lot of people don't realize, but if you look at the jaw of a pit bull and the way they bite, their jaws were specifically designed to, just like the bulldog, to grab and hold, because a lot of times at that era, you weren't always killing the game you caught. Sometimes you wanted that game alive. You would go and catch feral hogs to replenish your hogs and things like that. So it's just the pit bull as a breed just had a really sad turn of events in its coming into existence. But there was a time period that the American pit bull was considered the nanny dog. It was considered the safest dog to leave your children with at one point in our history. It was actually so common to be a child-friendly dog that the original Little Rascals, the original dog for the Little Rascals, was a pit bull. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think it's a bulldog, but he was in fact the pit bull, and he was a pit bull from a rather famous fighting line.
Yeah, people talk about dangerous dogs. It's been my experience, the ones that I have personally had the most problems with were never pit bulls. They were never German shepherds. it was the Dobermans, the Chows. Those are the ones that I've always had the issues with. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just me, but
Well, popularity at the time. You know, if you look at it, it's like anything else. Dogs went through, they almost went through, you could call it a state of fashion. There was a time period where Dobermans were synonymous with gangsters. I mean, literally, there's old photos of just about every famous New York gangster with a Doberman. And then Rottweilers were also a really another big popular one for a long time with inside drug culture. And so Rottweilers became synonymous with being security guards that drug owners, you know, or drug runners had. And it got developed into the culture, and it even got enveloped into like the TV and the movies of those eras to an extent. The chows came later, and the chows, again, one of the big imports behind the chow was it started with hunters looking for a better bear dog. And then very quickly, because the underground world of dog fighting existed, they found that chows were a very popular combatant for the pit bull, because the chows could a lot of times kill a pit bull, even though the chow couldn't live usually for as many fights. And so it had this whole underground element to those dogs that made them very popular and synonymous inside pop culture. The pit bull became a pop culture icon in the 90s.
so you go through the book here, and you talk about the different aspects of training, muscle training, flexibility training. Um, how do you mix the two?
I judge by the day. A flexibility training where I just want my dog to try to get their bodies use their full range of motion is, you know, it's a good day if I think the dog is tired, or if the weather's not great. So if we go out and it's, you know, 108 degrees outside, I know I don't want to be standing out in that very long, and I'm pretty sure my dog doesn't either. So if I wouldn't want to work in that weather, I know he doesn't want to work in that weather. Going back to our previous rule about your dog comes first, um, and so, you know, that's a good day for me to slip in. Hey, let's, you know, do a lot of exercises that put the dog in lots of different positions. And of course, to the dog, this is, again, if training is done right, your dog always associates it with, we're playing. And so, you know, having the dog reach up and touch the top of, you know, a picnic table with his front paws, or having him walk up, you know, and over a box and things like that. These are all fun things to the dog, and they're low impact, but each activity causes the dog to use a full range of motion in their legs, or to stretch out their back. And so the dog is essentially stretching all their muscles and stretching out and helping keep that flexibility, because dogs, just like with people, you either use it or you lose it. And like, you know, so, but days that the weather's good, I might choose to strength train my dog. I might want to work on their muscle structure. And a lot of people think that people train their dogs, you know, with weights for muscle, because they think that, well, you just want to look cool. Well, I guarantee you, when you're up at 4 a.m, you're not up at 4 a.m at the park lugging out equipment to train your dog because you want to look cool. There ain't nobody in their right mind at the park at 4 a.m for you to look cool in front of, you know. But I primarily have larger dogs, and larger dogs are notorious for destroying their joints. The back hip joints, the front shoulder joints always get destroyed. And to avoid that, I don't run my dogs more than I have to. So how do I keep my dog in shape? How do I keep him lean? How do I keep him from getting fat without running him all the time, without taking him on, you know, 10-mile walks? Well, I can do that by, one, controlling his food, and two, by giving his muscles something that a lot of large dogs were actually designed to do, some work to do. And so I can put my dog in a harness and have him drag chain behind him. And a lot of people think they get this weird notion where they think, oh, that's somehow going to hurt the dog. It's the most low impact form of exercise the dog can do. And 1 mile of pulling chain, and not super heavy chain, just moderate chain that the dog barely notices is behind him, 1 mile of walking around like that is the equivalency of a 10-mile walk with your dog.
So you're maximizing the efficiency.
You're maximizing the efficiency, and you're limiting how much impact the muscles actually take. Because one thing, if you take that same dog on a 10-mile walk, as that dog gets more and more tired on the walk, they start slamming their body harder and harder on the joints as the muscles tire out. Well, when the dog was hooked up to the weight harness and the dog is walking casually, pulling the weight behind him, the muscles are all engaged, and you're able to get the most amount of work and the most payout before the muscles start to actually give out.
Which makes sense. And I guess you could do that with any size dog, basically.
You can, yeah.
From a Chihuahua all the way up to, a Mastiff.
Oh yeah, they actually make harnesses for Chihuahuas, and you see Chihuahuas every now and then pulling milk jugs behind them.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense. You go out for your daily walk around a football field, take the dog with you.
Yep.
It just makes sense. And I guess you would increase the weight depending on, basically like anybody doing a workout. If you want to get the dog a light workout that day, you go with a lighter chain, a heavier workout, a heavier chain.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I tell people all the time, people always ask me, like, well, how do I decide how much weight my dog pulls that day? We start pulling. We just go out there and we start. And if for whatever reason that day I notice that he's getting ahead of me and he's moving real quick, well, we increase the weight a little bit. If I notice that he's kind of dragging, or he seems like he's not, for whatever reason, he's moving slower, we reduce the weight. We adjust it to how the dog is feeling that day. That's one of the hard parts when people ask about, a lot of people contact me, they want routines, and they want me to give them these set in stone numbers. And I always tell them everything is adjustable. If you go to the gym, go ahead.
You don't want to set a routine and just stick to the same thing every day, because dogs, like humans, they do get bored.
That's right. And just like humans, some days they feel better than others. I mean, I can't even tell you how many days I've gone into the gym and I look at my own workout and I'm like, I'm supposed to bench 405 today, but I really feel tired. Yeah, we're not doing that.
Yeah, and then the dog don't have a mouth to say, hey, look, dude, I'm just not feeling it right now.
Exactly. And that's why it's important that we understand how they communicate with their bodies so that we can make that call.
You know what? Are you up for some questions from our wonderful audience?
Definitely.
Well, let's see if they got anything for you out there. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a question or, a concern, fire it out. We will do our best to get it answered for you. Did I see a tiny sled pulled by a team of Chihuahuas? I think everybody would like to see that, Gary. I think that would be hilarious. By the way,
I would like this, but I want to see a cat on that sled,
and that would be even better. Put him in the front. Where is the best donut? I don't think that has anything to do with dogs. Have you ever noticed a hierarchy amongst the dogs that you kept?
Oh yeah, I'm actually somebody. There are some dog trainers today who don't believe in pack theory. I am not one of those people. I believe in pack theory because I believe that all dogs have a hierarchy, and Anybody who watches dogs in the wild will tell you that much. Dogs without hierarchy are more likely to have fights. So it's up to you as the handler to establish the hierarchy. And of course, it's your job as the handler to make sure you establish that you are number one.
Yeah, you are alpha.
Once you establish that, then there's the next level. And then we used to call that the lead dog, the dog who was basically your right hand. Your lead dog is the dog that you normally, he was the oldest in the group, and he's normally the dog you actually trained before you got the other dogs. So that dog helped you train the other dogs as they came up. And if you establish that type of hierarchy, you can keep the fighting between the dogs at a real low level, if potentially without any real fights at all. And so it's important to watch that kind of stuff. And your dogs sometimes will change the hierarchy. Sometimes your dogs will, as you have to watch out for a younger dog with an older dog. There might come that time where that younger dog feels it's his time to be the leader. And it's up to you. A lot of times when a younger dog steps up like that, it's because the handler's gotten lax, and so the dogs on some level have actually lost respect for the handler. That can be a very dangerous situation depending on the type of dogs you keep. And by type of dogs, I'm not referring to breed, but I'm referring to the job those dogs have. You don't want a bunch of canine units that are military trained losing respect for their handlers.
No, that would be a bad thing.
Yeah. So it's always important that if you do see hierarchy fighting among your dogs, it's because the dogs they're not even considering you part of the equation. So you need to make sure you go back and establish that, hey, I'm in charge here. I'm the dog that you all look up to. There's no need for you guys to fight amongst each other unless you're ready to take me. And so once you have...
And you never let them think that they can take you.
No. Which is kind of an ironic thing because I get in a bite suit and let my dogs bite me.
Yeah, that's... we didn't have a bite suit. What I would do, though, is wrap 3 or 4 pillows around my arm and play tug of war with Tiny. And the pillows didn't last long, I'll tell you.
Well, Pinewoods has an actual question out there real quick. So my thoughts on dogs in the bed. I think so long as your dog is trained to sleep where you want them to, I think that is up to you. None of my dogs, I'll tell you right now, start in my bed. My dogs also are, I train every dog that I own to be kennel trained. They learn from the moment they're a puppy in my home to adulthood to sleep inside a kennel. Now, that being said, that does not mean that my dogs always sleep in their kennels. Matter of fact, my dog spends most nights sleeping either on my feet or at the foot of the bed. But if I were to come home and I didn't want him in the bedroom for any particular reason, maybe I'm not feeling good, or maybe it's the anniversary, or maybe me and the wife just had, tied one on, I can tell him to go to his kennel and he'll stay there without giving me any grief. I don't like to start dogs off sleeping. To me, sleeping in the bed or sleeping even in the same room, that's an earned privilege that we let them have after we've established what the basic ground rules are. Because otherwise you end up, in my experiences, you'll end up with a dog that always wants to be in your bed, who thinks the bed belongs to them, and the bed doesn't belong to them. The bed, the house, nothing belongs to them. The only thing that belongs to them is what I put inside their kennel. Which actually, I guess while I'm on that topic, I'll address kennels real quick. My dog's kennel, unless I close the door because he's in it and I need him to stay there, the kennel door is always open. I will never give my dog a command when they're inside their kennel. Ever. Not unless it's some kind of emergency. If my dog walks inside their kennel, it doesn't matter if I'm mad at them. It doesn't matter if they did something wrong. all of my business stops the moment they go inside that box. That is their place for safety. And I established that from the time they're very young, because I have, while I don't have any children of my own, I have an army. I have my own baseball team worth of nieces and nephews, and there's always kids in my house. So I was taught, I shouldn't say I learned, I was taught when I was younger that the easiest way to keep a dog from biting a child is to give the dog a place that the dog knows it can get away from the stress. And so we were taught when we were kids, if the dog goes in the kennel, you leave the dog alone. You don't bug that dog. And it's how I've raised all my dogs. And even when I've had the kids, my brother's twins, hanging on my dog's ears and pulling their tails and being dragged around the house by the dog, the kids are all taught, if the dog goes in the kennel, you leave the dog alone. And when my dogs some of my dogs over the years have been big enough and strong enough to kill pigs on their own, and have ragdolled grown men, have been gentle with the kids. And as soon as the kids get on their nerves and they've had enough, they get up and they walk into their kennel. And it really, inside the house, it keeps them from ever needing to get aggressive because they never feel trapped.
Caleb out there has a question for you. So I have an American Bulldog, awesome dog, great with kids, cats, everything. We have issues when it comes to other dogs. I know it's a broad subject, but any tips?
I'm going to start to address this, but while I address this, I'd like you to answer my question, Caleb. What type of American Bulldog? Because there's three out there. I'd like to know what yours is. But my advice for you and other dogs, well, you're going to need to find somebody whose dog you like and who knows you, so that way there's no misunderstanding. And go to a public park, preferably a park you've never been to before, a park that your dog does not know, and practice meeting the other dog. Exposure is the answer. And you walk up on leash. The moment your dog starts to get out of line, you remind your dog that, hey, I make the decisions about who we talk to and who we don't talk to. And you come up, and your dog doesn't have to interact with the other dog. Never force your dog to interact with another dog. If your dog, that's fine. But you make sure that you keep your dog in check, and your dog knows better than to act up. You might not ever be at the point where your dog wants to interact with other people's dogs, but you want to be at a point where if you're walking down the street and somebody approaches you and their dog is behaving, you want to make sure your dog is behaving. And if the two of you want to stand and talk for a minute, that you're not feeling like you need to rush by because, oh, my dog's going to react. No, if I stop and I want to talk to somebody, my dog is going to sit there and wait. My dog doesn't need to interact with the other dog at all, but he definitely needs to behave himself. And, you might want to look into a trainer in your area and tell them, this is what I'm trying to do. I don't need my dog to be friendly, but I need my dog to behave. And a good trainer should be able to help you with that. You should be able to work that out. As for telling an American Bulldog to be nice to another dog inside your property or inside your house, I have no advice on that because I've never trained my dogs to be nice to strangers inside my house.
Yeah, if they come home with me, they're okay. If they don't, well then.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like my dogs wait and they see, okay, did Dad bring that person in? Okay.
Exactly. You do not. I have never been one that liked my dogs to be friendly with just anybody and everybody. Especially when it comes to them being on my own property. If my dog's on my property and somebody else shows up, that's bad juju. If my dog's not letting him know real quick that he's not supposed to be there. I have never liked the idea of keeping a dog that was not protective of the house and the land that it lives on. And this is why I'm not a big fan of smaller dog breeds. Uh, Most people look at something like a Chihuahua, and yes, they're ankle biters, and yes, they will get your attention, but most people is not going to consider a Chihuahua a serious threat. On the other hand, if they see a German Shepherd, they start thinking twice.
Well, how about this, Ellis? I'll tell you something kind of fun. And this is one of the common things I train for people. You have a little dog like a Chihuahua. I teach it to bark at the burglar and run around the burglar's feet. And then I'll train your German Shepherd or your Rottweiler to not bark at all and just come a running to where the little dog barks.
There you go. There you go. That's ingenious.
Believe it or not, a lot of little dogs were came into existence, and their sole job on properties and estates that they were on was they weren't there for actual protection. They were there to tell the bigger dogs where to go.
Yeah. An alarm system.
Yeah, that they were the original alarm system.
Being a gun channel, I have to ask, getting the dog used to the sound of guns, specifically dogs, but could any dog?
So my dogs are all used to gunfire, and it's definitely a trickier subject because there's always the argument of hearing protection for dogs. I'm actually in talks right now with a company that makes some hearing protection for dogs. I'll be testing out hopefully in the next couple of weeks as soon as they send it to me. But again, I'm going to assume that we're talking about starting with a dog from a young age and working our way up. I will take my dogs to the gun range when they're young, and I'll put them in a kennel underneath the shooting table. And we'll start with a small caliber. I usually start with a 9mm, and we fire it. And then I give the dog some treats. And then I shoot the gun, and I give the dog a treat. Maybe I pet them, I give them some praise. And by the time I run through 2 magazines, that dog is no longer afraid of gunfire, because that dog now associates gunfire with food and praise. And then we up the caliber. And we continue that all the way until that dog can handle AR-15 level noise without freaking out. And it usually takes me about 6 days of consistent work to get the dog at that level. And then there's more advanced stuff after that. But that's the basics, is just getting the dog to associate that loud noise with positive reinforcement.
Do you suggest starting off with smaller caliber weapons, or?
Yeah, I always start off smaller caliber just because the amount of noise level.
Yeah. Maybe just a cat going off.
See, I don't do that simply because how do I put this? Well, probably one, I don't think I've ever owned a dog that would have responded to a cap going off. But I've always started at 9mm because a lot of times that's the smallest gun I own.
Okay. But you wouldn't be opposed to like a 22, 25?
Oh, not at all. I always tell people start off with the lowest caliber you have. Though be careful with that because sometimes that can be deceptive. There are some 22 rifles out there that can be much louder than a 9mm.
Yeah, there are. I guess that's something to think about.
Yeah, so I always tell people sometimes the caliber can be deceptive. I mean, something to keep in mind. You want to start off with your quietest ammo and work your way up.
Shoot two, 3, then food. Ian says.
Yeah, I mean that's what a lot of field guys do with the dogs they use with shotguns. Like I said, I start off with mine, giving them food and praise after the first shot. But as we work our way through, the shots become, he has to wait longer to get those rewards. Yes.
What about snacks for dogs?
Snacks?
Yeah.
So I don't use snacks too often outside of like rewards for tasks. I like to use dried liver as a primary because it's next to no dog is allergic to it. And it also is full of vitamins, protein, everything the dog needs to be healthy. and it doesn't fill up the dog. So that you could be amazed at how much dried liver a dog will eat and still be hungry.
Now, chicken liver, beef liver, it don't matter.
Stewart's comes in chicken, beef, and pork. So I usually mix it up depending on what's on sale.
Okay, well, there you go. That's good advice, and it's probably a lot healthier than the snacks you buy at PetSmart.
You can buy Stewart's at PetSmart.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This is again where I tell people about reading labels. You would not eat something if you turned it around and every ingredient in there was some strange chemical. You would look at that and go, yeah, I might eat it anyway, but you know it ain't healthy. You know it.
Yeah.
It's turn those dog treats around. And here's what I always tell people. Some people will complain about the price for good dog treats. When you have a dog who makes, or for example, one of my Mastiffs, when you have a Mastiff that makes it to 13 years old and you've never had to take him to the vet for anything other than a regular checkup, you will have saved so much money in vet bills, you don't care that the feeding and snacks cost you more.
Yeah. Another question from Woods. Teaching dogs is not that different from teaching children. Classical conditioning, then operant conditioning. Thoughts?
I agree. It is very similar to teaching children. I often tell people if you don't have the patience for a dog, you definitely don't have the patience for a kid.
Yeah, and sometimes kids need a lot of patience.
I see a question from Tread out there. Tread, I do not free feed my dogs. My dogs eat once a day, the same time of day, every day. Food is a resource. Food is not left out willy-nilly.
So you got them on a set schedule with feeding.
I try to. I mean, sometimes, don't get me wrong, sometimes I might feed them an hour earlier or an hour later, depending on my schedule. But food is a resource. And if resources are always left out, then they're no longer valuable. And so they lose value. I don't want and also I feed my dogs a primarily raw diet. So I'm definitely not leaving food out because then it'll go bad.
Yeah.
But when it comes, that's another thing. Free feeding your dog is kind of asking also for your dog to either become picky with their food, which is what I talk about with the resources. Odds are, if somebody tells me my dog turns up their nose and will not eat X food, 9 out of 10 people are leaving food out all the time. So the food has no value because it's always there. So of course the dog becomes picky. And problem 2 is if your dog is obese, I'm willing to bet you leave food out for your dog all the time. Because some dogs will eat out of boredom.
Yeah, just get bored and go eat. Like some humans.
Yep.
Yeah. In the greater scheme of things, dogs are not that different from us when it comes to things like that. They get bored, they get, complacent, they get aggravated. They have the same emotional frames of mind as we do for the most part. They just deal with it a little differently from time to time.
Well, I think dogs are probably the closest a dog's stomach is the closest thing to a human stomach you're going to see. It's closer than any chimp's. And emotionally, dogs seem to share just about the same amount of emotions as we do. So it's possible that even though we are very far away on a genetic level, that we are probably two of the most similar animals on the planet.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to do it, but I'm going to have to cut this one off. I have work tomorrow, and so does he. So we've run a little bit over an hour, so I think we've done good. Man, I want to thank you for being on the show tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Think we were supposed to do this a couple weeks back. Things got all screwed up with my new job and this, that, and the other. So, but it's been a good show. I'm glad you stopped by. I'm glad you stayed up. Glad you put up with me for an hour.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And you know, I'm going to slip one last plug in here on everybody before we log off. If you guys want to continue this conversation about dogs, please feel free to visit us over at muscledogmafia.com. There's a forum page over there. It's completely free for you guys to use. And it's also got a lot of work that I've already produced. So some of your questions might already be answered there.
Okay, now where can they pick up the book?
They can also pick up the book by going to muscledogmafia.com. The links for the book are there. And here's the thing. The link on the book right now is currently attached with Gun Channels. So if you do buy the book, please buy it by going through the link through there. So that way you can help support both things that we all love.
Amen. And ladies and gentlemen, the name of the book is Pound for Pound, Building a Healthy Athletic Dogs. Corey Alec Mathis. Great name, by the way.
Thank you.
I did not know your last name is Mathis.
Yes, sir.
Well, you're almost royalty.
No, I'm not. My family changed their name when we came over on the boat.
Oh well. I tried.
We were originally a bunch of Irish Quins.
There ain't nothing wrong with being Irish. There ain't nothing wrong with Quins either. So anyway, guys, I appreciate everybody that's hung around tonight. I thought it was a great show. Thank you again for showing up. Thank all of you for watching. Guys, we will see you next week. And I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do for the what was the Tuesday night show. I haven't made up my mind what I'm going to do about that yet. As soon as I figure that out, I will let you guys know. Again, thanks. God bless you all. Have a good night. We'll catch you next week with Ghost Tactical, hopefully. Take care, guys.